Hey everyone, this is Bunny, and today we are going to talk about palettes for painting your miniatures. I'm going to focus a lot of this video on the wet palette, but before we talk about the wet palette, let's just talk about other options, because you do not require a wet palette. Okay, you can use a piece of cardboard, you can use like a little plastic tray that has nothing in it. That's fine. You can use the lid of a Tupperware. It doesn't matter. You can use anything you like that'll hold your paint. I don't love the idea of cardboard or, little plastic trays or things like this. I don't love that because the paint dries really, really fast. You have to remember acrylic paint dries pretty darn quick. So I don't love that. So if you can, I wouldn't use whatever's lying around your house. This is one of the few times I'm going to tell you to spend a little bit of money. Now, if you can't afford a wet palette, but you do want like a palette, you can get, now this is obviously a well-used palette, but you can get just one of these standard art palettes that you can just mix your colors in and use your colors. And if it has a lid, you can keep your paints a little bit wet for a little bit longer. It's not as good as a wet palette, but it'll do. I don't use this for that anymore. Instead, what I do is I use this for mixing like glazes and washes and stuff like that. So I don't technically use this for my paints anymore, but you can. I mean, you absolutely can. That's what it's designed for. So now I'm just going to talk about the wet palette because really, I recommend people get a wet palette. You can get cheap brushes, you can use cheap paints, all of that's fine. I recommend you spend the money on a decent wet palette. Now, I'm using the one from, the smaller one from Redgrass Games. I did use another one. I don't remember the name of it, honestly. I lost it somewhere when we moved. I don't remember what brand it was. I really don't. I'm not even going to try to guess because I'll probably say the wrong thing. But I use this Redgrass one. This is excellent, and I will provide a link. I believe you can get these on Amazon. I got mine through a Kickstarter. So this is what my palette looks like. I actually have two of them. Okay, this isn't the only one I have. I actually have two. And you'll see the other one when I'm showing you how to set up the palette. But I just want to show you this one now, and I deliberately let my paint get a little bit squirrely so we can talk about some of the problems. That's not the point. We'll talk about that in a minute. So this is the Redgrass Games wet palette. You can get a lot of different brands. Just check the reviews. I do recommend the Redgrass Games because it's the one I've used. I can't recommend or discourage other brands because I haven't used very many. I've only used two, and I don't remember the name of the brand that I had before this. So I can't actually give you a great review of anything other than this one. I adore this one. It's so excellent, and I absolutely love it. So wet palettes are a little bit of an investment. Usually you can get a good one with replacement hydration membranes, that's this paper, and a replacement sponge. You can see there's a sponge underneath here. You can usually get them for under $100 if you're looking for a smaller one. This is a smaller one. I do recommend getting a smaller one. Remember, my channel is all about teaching you how to do it yourself, fairly cheap, fairly easy, not having to spend months on one miniature, not having to spend a ton of money. So I really do recommend the Redgrass because this one specific is a little bit smaller and it's not super expensive. Now you can spend a lot of money on a wet palette. There are wet palettes that are really expensive. You don't have to do that. Okay, so the purpose of a wet palette is to keep your paint wet and workable for your painting session. That painting session might be a few hours, it might be a few days, okay? I'm just going to grab a paintbrush here. And really, it should be a single painting session, and I would recommend not trying to keep paint in here longer than a week. I've had this one setting up for a few days so that I could specifically show you some of the different things that can happen with your paint, okay? So what I've done here is put some paint and let it kind of sort of dry out. So you'll see a couple that are kind of sort of dried out. I put a paint in here and let it get really wet and mushy. And I put some paints, a couple of different colors in here just to show you how they normally should look. Okay? Acrylic paint dries really, really, really fast. And generally we're painting miniatures with acrylic paint. Okay, so it dries really, really, really fast. Okay, incredibly fast. So you want to be able to keep your paints wet and workable. If you don't use a wet palette, so if you're just using like a little tray where you put your paints, okay, that's fine, but you'll notice your paint starts to dry in your trays really, really fast. That leads to wasted paint or sitting there and trying to reconstitute a paint with water and trying desperately to use up that last little bit. It's not ideal, okay? Not ideal. I generally don't recommend that. So yes, a wet palette will help you keep your paints nice and pliable. You see how pliable this is? This has been in here for about 24 hours. This is still a really pliable paint. I'll just rinse that brush. But it's still a nice pliable paint, even though that's been in there. Actually, I think it's been in there 48 hours. What's today? Yeah, about 48 hours. These 3 paints have been sitting there, covered up with the lid, and they're still really easy to work with. No big deal. I am going to show you how to set up the palette. Not this palette, I have 2 of them. So we're going to go over onto the other side, or maybe I'll just do it here. Maybe I'll just switch out. But I will show you how to set up palettes. So we will come right back with a clean and cleaned out palette, and I'll probably just do it in the kitchen. So let's move over to the kitchen and we will set up a clean new palette. I'll show you how to set that up, then we'll come back out here. All right, so we're here in the kitchen. I'm on the stove because the stove is right next to the sink, and we are going to set up our wet palette. So what do you need? You need your palette, you need the bottom and the top. You are going to need a hydration membrane. Now your hydration membrane should have a top and a bottom. So in this case, this side with the printed words is the bottom. And you're going to need your sponge. Now, your wet palette will probably come with really specific instructions. You should follow those. But in general, how do you set this up? Well, first you get yourself a tiny little cup, fill it with some water. That's why we're in here, because it's right next to the sink. So there's some water right there. Excellent. Now we're going to take our sponge, and you notice our sponge is pretty hard. Okay, that's normal. What we want to do is we want to wet down this sponge. Now, in the case of the sponges I'm using for my Redgrass Games palette, you have a little symbol in the corner, and that tells you this is the top. So when I put the sponge in here, I want this little symbol on the top. I don't want it facing down. But this sponge is not ready to insert. I mean, it doesn't even look big enough, and it's not. So what we want to do is we want to go get this wet. I'm going to move over to the sink, and I'll get this wet. And it's not difficult. You just need to make sure it fully absorbs the water, and it'll darken in color a tiny bit, and it'll become pliable. Okay. Make sure it absorbs as much water as it can. I like to do it under running water, but you can just submerge it in a bowl. Alright, so I probably just cut out a whole section of me being at the sink wetting this down because it's boring to watch. So you just wet this down until it is pliable and soft, then you squeeze the excess water out of it. Then we're going to place this in our base, and we're going to take our small cup of warm water and pour that all over our sponge. There we go. And just let that absorb for a minute or 2. Now we are going to dump out some water, because what we want is we want the water not above the sponge. We do want some excess water in there, but we don't want it above the sponge. So just kind of let that sponge soak up that water for a minute. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go dump out some of the excess. We want a little of this excess water. So I'm just going to go over here. Okay. So see, I want a little bit excess water in there, and you can always add more as you're painting. Then we're going to take our hydration membrane, which I already got wet by accident, not a big deal. This is a fresh hydration membrane. You're going to put that in here. And what you're going to do is, I got hair on my hand. That's fun. But you're going to smooth that out so that kind of adheres. You don't want a lot of these air bubbles. So kind of just push those to the side. It's just an air bubble. Just push that out of the way. There you go. And then what you're going to do, you're going to put the lid on and leave that closed for about 15 minutes, okay? And while we are waiting for this to set up, get ready because it's got to kind of finish absorbing water, and you can always add more water if you need to. So we are going to pop back into the other room, and we are going to talk about some of the problems you might have with your wet palette and how to solve them. But we're going to do that with the other, I have two of these, so we're going to do that with my other one that still has paint on it. So back into the other room. All right, so now that we know how to set up our palette, which we did, we set up a palette out in the kitchen. So now we're back here and we're going to talk about some of the problems you might encounter and how to kind of fix them. So the first problem you might have is dry paint. So you'll see I have a couple of sections that are kind of dry. I did that on purpose. This one's been sitting for a couple days doing different things to it so that I can show you the differences and the different problems you might have. So if you have paints that are starting to dry, so they're starting to look like this when you use them instead of nice and smooth like these guys. So a paint that's starting to dry, there's a couple of things you can do. First of all, they might be drying because you simply have a really dry climate. Now that is here. Okay, here it is really dry. I'm talking usually less than, at least in the house. Outside it's more humid, but in the house here, the way our house is built, it's a fairly dry home. So we're talking less than 40% humidity most of the time. So that's the primary problem I have, is paint drying out. So what can you do about it? You can add a humidifier. I actually have a humidifier down in that corner, which has helped significantly. So add a small humidifier to your room. That'll help out. Some people tell you you should add an extra sponge, so have two sponges. That didn't work for me. If that works for you, I'm glad, but adding an extra sponge simply didn't work very well for me. You can add more water to your palette, so I do that as well as having the humidifier running. So I add quite a bit of extra water to my palette. That does tend to work, but the double sponge thing didn't work. You have to remember to close your lid tightly. So when we're using these palettes, you have to put the lid on and not just let it sit there. You actually have to push, okay, so it seals. That'll help keep your palette moist. And you'd want to open it gently because I don't want to splatter paint everywhere. There we go. But you want to keep that lid tightly clipped down to keep the moisture in there. And you might want to store it in the fridge. It works. I don't know why it works, but closing up your palette nice and tight and putting it in the fridge will help, especially if you want to keep your paints more than about 3 days. You definitely can store it in the fridge. It does work. I don't know why. You can try to rehydrate your paints with water. So you could take your paintbrush, get it really, really dripping, and then try to get it in here and really kind of work that paint. So you see how dry that one is? So you can really try to work that paint, okay, and try to get it reconstituted. That may or may not work. Sometimes it simply isn't going to happen, right? Like this one's real chunky. So this may not properly reconstitute. So that's okay if it doesn't. That's why you should work with smaller amounts of paint. You're wondering why I have such big chunks of paint in here right now. And the answer to that is I wanted you to be able to see. I do usually work with much smaller dots of paint, unless I'm doing a large miniature and I know I'm going to need a lot of one color. But most of the time it's just little dots. But I did larger sections so you could see, because it doesn't show up great on camera when you're using little ones. So, if none of this is working, so if you're trying to reconstitute dried paints and this it's not working, it's not going to help. Your paint might be too old. If you've kept your palette for more than a week without cleaning it and refreshing it, it might just be that you can't keep going anymore. You have to stop, clean your palette, and fix the problem and start from scratch. That's normal. I generally recommend with a wet palette cleaning it thoroughly once a week. I will show you how to clean it. We will in fact clean this one in a few minutes. So if you do have a lot of drying paint, maybe you just need to start again. If it wasn't like that and now it is, maybe you just need to clean your palette. Liquefying paint. You will see I have liquefied paint here. Okay, and this is actually two colors bled together. But liquefying paint, that's when your paint kind of separates and runs all over the place. It's really annoying. And there aren't a lot of great solutions other than clean your palette and start again. There are some things you can try. You can try, for example, adding a dehumidifier to your room. That can work, but only if you have a dehumidifier big enough for the space. So if your dehumidifier can't keep up with the conditions in the room you're painting in, it's not going to help. So a dehumidifier that is appropriate for the space might help. You also want to maybe not put your lids on all the way. So I'm just going to put this paintbrush down. But you might want to crack your lids. How much? You have to experiment. So if you live in a really humid climate, you might want to leave your lids cracked. So maybe like that, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. It entirely depends. You might want to try reducing the amount of water that you put in your palette to begin with. So there's a little bit of experimentation if your problem is the paint is just too wet. So experiment a little bit. Somebody told me one time that you can add 2 pieces of paper. I don't find that works very well. I find that just wastes your hydration membranes. So, I mean, can you? Sure. Should you have to? No. So, you can also, again, store it in the fridge. Again, I don't know why that works, but it does. So what you can do is put your lid on, but not tightly. So just rest the lid on top and put it in the fridge. Again, if your problem is the runny paint. If your problem is the dry paint, seal the palette and put it in the fridge. The fridge works. I don't know. Separating paint. This is something people complain about, and it's normal. So you'll notice my purple here has separated, and it has some darker purple pieces. That's just because the paint separates. That's why we have to shake paint bottles or massage your paint tubes before you use them. So to fix that, you just mix that up. Okay, you just mix it together. It's not a big deal. This needs a little bit more. Hey, look, there we go. See, all the colors back together. So that is actually really easy to fix. So people complain about that, but the separating of paint happens whether it's a wet palette or not, and it happens whether it is a dry climate or not, whether you're in a humid area, it doesn't matter. The acrylic paints, they naturally want to separate a little bit. So if you have separating paint, just mix them back together with a paintbrush. It's not a big deal. That happens no matter what. What do you not use a wet palette for? Don't use it for dry brushing, because dry brushing, you need drier paint anyway. And you don't want to use it for washes, because washes are quite liquidy. They'll just flow off the edge. So again, something like this guy, you can use for a wash. But don't use this for a wash. It is a very effective tool if used properly. Okay, so I showed you how to put your wet palette together. Now we're going to go over to the kitchen again and show you how to clean this palette, because there is kind of an art to it, and you do want to make sure you're doing it correctly. So we're just going to wander back over to the kitchen, and I will show you how to clean this palette. All right, so we're over in the kitchen, and we're going to clean our palette. This is the same palette you saw just a minute ago. So you don't want to worry about this right this second. The first thing you need to do is worry about your membrane. So I'm using a Redgrass palette. These membranes can be reused quite a few times. So what we're going to do is we're going to take it and we're going to put it in the bottom of the sink. Actually, I'm going to hold it so you can see a little bit, but we're going to turn on the water and we're just going to rinse off the excess paint. Okay? Use your finger, but don't, I'm going to warn you right now, don't use your nails. Don't be picking at that paint. If you're using your nails, you're going to end up ripping your hydration membrane, and you don't want that. Okay? So use the pad of your thumb to just rinse the paint off. And it's very effective. Okay, and just continue to do that. If you have a spot where all the paint won't come off, it's not that big a deal. Okay, so if you have a spot where you have a little bit of the paint won't come off, just leave it. It is better to just leave it than to have an entire paper get ripped because you decided you had to pick it off. Do the best you can with your hand, okay, with just the pads of your thumb. Okay, that's what you want to do. So you might have a section where there's staining. That's not that big a deal. Okay? Yes, your hands will get messy during this. Remember, don't use your nails. Okay, just use your flat of your hand or the pad of your thumb or whatever. Just don't use your nails. No picking. Because these hydration membranes, at least the ones from Redgrass, are reusable 3 to 6 times, but I think I've used this pad, this membrane, I think I've reused it probably a dozen times. Okay. Alright, so what you're going to notice is that stained. That's okay. Okay, a little bit of staining is not that big a deal. So we're not going to worry about it too much. Just going to put that here. And then I'm just going to turn the camera off while I put some soapy water in the sink and rinse out the rest of the paint. Okay, so we'll be back once I've done that. You don't need to wash the sink filled with water. Okay, so what we want to do now, take your hydration membrane, drape that over, take your sponge, move that out of the way for a minute. You're going to want to submerge both halves of your wet palette in the warm water and just leave them in there for a minute. You want those to really soak. Now you want to take your sponge, get that in the water, and you really don't be too rough because you don't want to rip your sponge, but you still really want to wash it. You really want to get that soap in there. Okay? Because you want, especially if it was smelling kind of funky, you want to make sure you're getting that soap and really working it into that sponge, because you really want everything to come out of that sponge. Okay? And then take your hydration membrane and submerge it in the water. Okay? There we go. Just to finish cleaning it. Remember, be gentle with that hydration membrane. Don't pick at it. Okay. And then I'm just going to leave that on the side with soap on it. I like to use a bottle brush now, and just to really get in the grooves of my palette. So you want to make sure it's well cleaned. Okay, so clean out your lid. Let them soak for a few minutes. I like to let mine soak for 10 minutes or so in the warm soapy water. So let everything soak except the hydration membrane. And we will come back when that soaking's done. All right, everything's been soaking for a little while. So now what we want to do, pop that plug out and drain the water. But leave the stuff in there while it's draining. Now we're just going to rinse everything nicely. Okay, so take your hydration membrane, again, gentle with your hydration membranes. There we go. And then if there's any soap here, I'll just get rid of that. So, let that dry. Rinse your hydration sponge. Get all that soap out of it. You don't want soap sitting in it. Squeeze it out. Let that dry. And then just rinse your other two parts. Okay, we're just going to rinse thoroughly. And let those dry completely before you start using them. You can dry these pieces with a towel if you like. Do not reuse your sponge and your membrane until they are completely dry. Okay, you don't want to reuse a wet sponge. Let it dry out before you use it again. Okay, that's why I have at least 2 sponges at any given time. I actually have 3, and I have 2 different wet palettes so that I can rotate in and out. You really only need 1 palette. So let us go back to my painting table and wrap up. All right, so here we are, back with our fresh palette that we set up just a few minutes ago. I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to add some paint. Never hurts to kind of smooth those bubbles out again. It happens. Bubbles happen. They're not that big a deal. But you want your membrane to kind of adhere to the sponge. You don't want it floating. That's why we dumped out some of that water. So you don't want it floating. So now that we have finished doing everything, we have learned how to clean our palette, we've learned how to assemble our palette. So what we're going to do now is add some paint. So I'm actually adding colors I'm going to need instead of adding random colors. So I'm going to add a little bit of gold. There we go. I'm going to need some gold. And when you do it, you just add it in a little blob. And then you kind of want to just leave it for a few minutes. Okay? Just leave it. So don't add more than you need. I'm going to need a fair bit of gold, so I put quite a bit. I'm only going to need a dot of black. Okay, so literally just a dot, and then you just leave it. I'm going to need, if I could open this, that would be great. I'm going to need some gray, but not a ton. So we don't want to add too much. About that much is good for gray. And then you're just going to kind of let the paint relax into the palette, because it will. If you kind of just recover the palette after adding your paint and wait about another 15 minutes, your paint relaxes a little bit. And then a smidge of white. Okay, there we go. So those are probably the 4 colors I'm going to be working with right now. So that's the only colors I'm going to add. And then we're just going to pop our top back on. I'm just going to let it rest lightly. I don't need to push it down. And then just give those paints about 15 minutes to relax. Then you are ready to use your wet palette. Now you're ready to go. So I do recommend a wet palette. It is worth investing the money. I do recommend that people do that. So I will provide an Amazon link. I think it's on Amazon. If it's not an Amazon link, sorry, I couldn't find the right link then. But either way, I'll provide a link to this particular palette because it's the one I can vouch for. I'm not going to say anything positive or negative about brands I haven't used. If you are going to buy a different brand, remember to check the reviews and ask for some advice from other people you might know who paint. Because even if you're only painting 1 or 2 miniatures, I really do recommend a wet palette. One of the few times I tell you to invest money, even if you're only doing it for yourself and even if you're only going to do a haphazard job, it's just easier if you do have a wet palette, because it makes life just easier when it comes to painting. All right, and even if you're not going to paint a lot of miniatures, if you have any other paint jobs you would like to do, anything at all that where you use acrylic paint, this can work out really well. So that's about it for today. I hope you consider buying a wet palette. Obviously you can use just a little plastic tray if that's what you want, but a wet palette is definitely worth the money. That's about it for us today. I hope you'll be back with us next time. Bye!